Good evening. Welcome to the beginning of our third year of the Civil War Sesquicentennial Commemoration. I'm Dr. Ken Blankmeyer, the chairman of the committee, and I have a few things to say before we introduce one of our first introducers. This program has been paid for by a faculty innovation grant, Tulsa Community College Faculty Innovation Grant, and we are very grateful to have that. Those of you who have been bribed, don't forget to sign out. We know what happens if you sign in, then you leave, so you've got to sign out. No cell phones. Let me repeat that. No cell phones. If we see them, we'll step on them. Okay? Also, I might mention that if anybody is interested in a battlefield tour of Pea Ridge, we're going to be doing that October 15th. Now, the first priority is faculty here and historians, but if anybody's interested, I'd be glad to take your name, and if we have space, we could talk about it. Our next presentation is a marine archaeologist named Rick Powell, who has discovered a slave ship, the only known one in the Western Hemisphere, the Henrietta Marie. If you want to get our full program, we have some at our table, and you can pick one up on the way out. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce the president of the college, Dr. Tom McKeon.
Good evening and welcome to the Center for Creativity at Tulsa Community College. It's great to see the turnout this evening as we continue with the third year of the Civil War Sesquicentennial programming. And you've got a real treat this evening in Dr. Donald Bellows, who will be giving tonight's presentation and lecture on the British reaction to the American Revolution. Civil War, Civil War, thank you. What are we here for? And it's right there in front of me, as big as it is up there. I wanted just to recognize Ken Blankmeyer. He chairs the planning committee for this series and has for the last 3 years. A lot of faculty involvement in putting this on, and it's been an impressive series over the last 2 years, and we're looking forward to this year. I do want to just also mention the faculty innovation grants. That was something that was started at Tulsa Community College, I think about 12 years ago, and it was a contribution from AEP PSO to our foundation to fund faculty grants for programming outside the traditional classroom setting. And we believed over years that that was such an important aspect of a way we can deliver instruction to the community and beyond the classroom, that's built in now as part of an ongoing part of our budget. And so it's programs like this that we find to be very, very rewarding and enriching to the teaching that goes on in the classroom. At this time, I'd like to introduce Dr. Kristen Ortel from the University of Tulsa, and she's going to talk about an exciting program coming up very soon at TU. Welcome, Kristen.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Ken, for allowing me to use this mouthpiece to promote an event at the University of Tulsa Monday night, September 26th. You all are invited at the Allen Chapman Activity Center. We're bringing in Dr. William Freeling, who is a distinguished Civil War historian, professor emeritus from the University of Kentucky. He's taught at Johns Hopkins and Harvard as well. He will be giving a lecture about the Virginia Secession Convention, and rumor has it there will be even a slight moment of reenactment involving a gun. So I invite you all, 7 o'clock, Monday night, September 26th, TU's campus, the Allen Chapman Activity Center, and it should promises to be a very entertaining evening. There'll also be a book signing and a reception after the event. So it's also my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Donald Bellows. Dr. Bellows is the undergraduate advisor for history at Oklahoma State in Stillwater, and he teaches courses there in Western civilization and modern British history. He received his PhD at Claremont Graduate School in California and has taught courses in American British history for a variety of institutions, including this very fine institution here. So please welcome our speaker, Dr. Bellows.
Thank you, Kristen. It's a pleasure to be here, participate in TCC's celebration of the Sesquicentennial of the Civil War. And I'd also like to say thank you to my wife, who has presented, Dr. Virginia Bellows, who teaches here at TCC, who is going to provide us with probably the most entertaining portion of this presentation, the slides that you see above. Oh, the British reaction to the American Civil War was a crucial aspect of the Civil War for both the Union and the Confederacy. And I want to talk about that reaction during the first year of the war in 1861. The British reaction was so important because if the British had engaged actively, intervened in the Civil War, the most likely result of that would have been independence for the Confederacy and the division of the United States into two nations, the Confederacy and the Union. It was crucial for the Union, therefore.
Uh-oh. It's your fault, you're speaking.
So you can't hear me. How's that? All right, move up. So it was crucial for the Union that Britain not become directly involved in the Civil War, and that meant that the war existed on at least two levels. There was the military engagement, and there was a diplomatic struggle. The South needed to win that diplomatic war in order to have a real chance of winning the military war. The North needed to win that diplomatic war in order to avoid losing the military war. In other words, the North, as a society with more resources, a larger population, more industry, a more diversified economy, the North had the advantage as long as there was no outside interference, such as would be offered by Britain. At the same time, as an extension of this military and diplomatic struggle, you could argue that there was a third war, and that was a war of ideas. That is because, in the eyes of many, the Civil War was a test. It was a test of ideas about government, about governments that were viable, and what governments should do. And what this means is that there were three principal ideas that were involved in the war and that had a direct effect on the British and whether the British would get involved. And all of these will affect the British reaction and what they do. Let's see if I can make this work. Okay, three ideas. One of them was nationalism, and one was abolitionism, and one, which was probably the most central to the British reaction, was democracy. The Civil War was viewed in Britain as a referendum on democracy and whether democratic governments were desirable or even workable. Before 1865, democracy to most educated people in Europe, if seen as the wave of the future, was a tsunami. It was not a good idea. It was a threat. The Civil War will help change that, but not at first. The British initially thought that the Civil War, was a failure of government and a denial of reality. So the British reaction also is important because it gives us a different perspective on the war and on American history. In the diplomatic war during 1861, The three principal actors were, of course, the Confederacy, the Union, and Great Britain. No other European power was really likely to get involved unless Britain did. All three had certain goals involving national interest, and all had interests that they thought could be justified. The Confederacy's goal was to be independent and hence be free to conduct its own affairs. Its foreign policy was based principally on the ideas of one particular individual, at least one who expressed them, and this was, if I get it right, Senator James Hammond of South Carolina, who in 1858 said cotton was king. And what this meant was that the Southerners and many others believed that cotton could dictate policy for industrialized states. In other words, the cotton industry, textiles, were so important that these states would do whatever was necessary to obtain it. And certainly the cotton textile industry was important in Britain, either directly or indirectly. About 1/5 of the British population, 1/5, was connected to the cotton textile industry in Britain. And so people thought that if the cotton from the South, which, by the way, provided about 80% of the British supply, if that cotton was no longer available to the British, then Britain, the Southerners believed, would be forced to intervene. If they didn't, then there would be such economic pain and perhaps so much social unrest among the workers that there would be terrible trouble in Britain. So the Confederacy was counting on a quick end to the military war by achieving a quick victory in the diplomatic war. The Union's foreign policy under Lincoln and his Secretary of State, William Henry Seward, and what did I do, go backwards? This represents, again, the cotton textile industry in Britain, and of course the cotton mills, the cotton plantation. The Union foreign policy under Abraham Lincoln and William H. Seward, his Secretary of State, was initially more mixed. Its purpose was clear, that is, prevent Southern success and preserve the Union. How to do that was the question. Seward initially proposed a policy that was highly problematic. He thought he could solve the Civil War in one fell swoop. His panacea, his cure-all, was a foreign war, or to be more precise, the threat of a foreign war. If the United States, Seward suggested, were to be threatened with a foreign war, then the South would flock back to the Union out of patriotism. So Seward made threats, but the result was not to have the South come back, but instead he alienated the British and the French and the Spanish foreign ministers, all of whom he threatened with the possibility of war if they were to get involved somehow. Well, Lord Lyons, who was the British minister in Washington, if I could make this work, was actually pro-Union, as many members of the British government were. He was actually pro-Union, but in the face of these threats by Seward, he thought it was impossible in April of 1861 to propose that the British actually cooperate with the Union. So, in fact, the British became convinced, based on Seward's outbursts, that the Union wanted war, and they would continue to think this right through 1861, as late as the Trent crisis, which we'll get to in a minute. At the end of 1861, they thought the Union wanted war with Britain. Lincoln, for his part, will dismiss the proposals by Seward and emphasize instead the goal of keeping the European powers totally uninvolved. He argued that the whole question of secession was a domestic issue, and therefore the Southerners were simply rebels operating within the United States, and the Union then sought to prevent the Confederacy from being recognized in any way whatsoever. However, Lincoln's efforts to deny secession by, say, resupplying Fort Sumter or closing southern ports led almost immediately to trouble with Britain, because those efforts would interfere with foreign trade, with international commerce, which was a major British interest. Indeed, Britain's foreign policy, its overall foreign policy since 1815 and the end of the Napoleonic Wars, was focused primarily on two goals. One was maintaining stability and a balance of power in Europe, especially with France and Russia contained. And the other was maintaining its naval supremacy and its interests in the rest of the world. And those interests stretched worldwide. Britain's economic success as the leading industrialized state meant that it could outproduce everybody else, and it was the greatest maritime power. It had the strongest navy, and the fact that it had acquired strategic bases around the globe. All of those points meant that Britain could achieve, by mid-19th century, many of its goals simply by economic means, and often simply the threat of military action. So one could argue that Britain was a satiated power politically after 1815. In other words, it was basically satisfied in political terms, and therefore its foreign policy on political matters tended to be defensive, not aggressive. Generally, then, it sought to maintain existing conditions, and that would include its own primacy. On commercial matters, though, Britain was insatiable. It wanted more trade, it wanted to produce more goods, it wanted more investments, more return on its investments overseas, and that meant it wanted peace. So Britain opposed the expansion of other states, whether in Asia or Europe or the Americas. It opposed expansion and wanted to keep things basically the way they were, because larger, aggressive states would be a threat to international commerce and therefore its own interests. As a result, the division of the United States into two nations, which is what the Civil War promised, the division of the United States into two nations, the creation of a balance of power in North America, and the emergence of two trading partners, say the North and the South, would all be in Britain's national interest. But war and any interference in international commerce would not be in Britain's interest. Britain, therefore, was highly ambivalent about the war in North America. A divided United States would be good, but war or poor relations with either side would not be good. Britain initially will sympathize with the South, as we'll see, but it did not want war with the North. It didn't really want war at all. Britain's ideas suggested that an American Civil War would be simply futile, an unnecessary slaughter. But that also meant that for humanitarian reasons, if not economic ones, for humanitarian reasons perhaps, intervention might be necessary. Indeed, the three ideas that I mentioned a bit ago influenced British opinion and policy and helped make the Civil War a war of ideas. The first of these ideas, you remember, was nationalism. Nationalism has taken several different forms during the period since its modern incarnation with the French Revolution in 1789. And the form that received the most attention from about 1789 to 1850 was known as liberal nationalism. And it was called liberal nationalism by its advocates like Giuseppe Mazzini of Italy because it held that each distinct people should be able to govern themselves. They ought to have their own government. So they ought to have that liberty. That was the argument. Liberal nationalism fades in Europe after 1848, but in the 1850s and 60s, new nation states did form, and formed by force of arms. This new militant nationalism in the 1850s and 60s, sometimes called integral nationalism, seemingly inspired Prussia under Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of Prussia, to unite Germany and form it as a modern state by a series of wars in the 1860s. And at about the same time, Italy will be united by similar efforts, a rebellion against Austria and attempts at unity by Giuseppe Garibaldi, who, in the 1860s, as a result of his efforts to unite Italy, became a virtual hero in Britain at the very same time that the Confederacy is doing what? Trying to establish its own state. Garibaldi is a hero. How are the British going to look at the Confederacy? So the South's effort could be seen as part of a pattern promoting liberty, while the North's effort to stop it could be seen as tyrannical and vindictive. And that is the way many Britons saw it. Now, Britons could focus on secession as an effort by a distinct people to govern themselves, partly because the second idea, shaping the British opinion about the American Civil War, was initially marginalized, and that was anti-slavery. The anti-slavery sentiment in Britain was high. The British had made the slave trade illegal in 1807. They had banished slavery from the British Empire in 1833, and many Britons by mid-century opposed slavery and considered it a moral duty, even a personal moral duty, to get rid of it, to end it. And that perhaps is shown by the popularity of Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which in its first year, in 1852, sold about 1 million copies in Britain compared to 300,000 in the United States. The United States then, to many Britons, seemed intransigent, if not immoral, on that issue. If the North had declared at the beginning of the war that it was fighting to end slavery, then many Britons would have supported such an effort. But Lincoln, in his inaugural address of 1861, had denied that intent in so many words. However, even if slavery had been the issue for the North, many Britons thought war was still not necessary. Slavery, they thought, could be left to die on its own. And the British argued that soon after secession, it would die. And that was because, the British said, the South would come under enormous international pressure to end slavery, pressure that the Union, the United States as a larger country, had been able to resist. But if the Union was not fighting to end slavery, then what was it fighting for? The British had two suspicions, the results of two attitudes toward the United States. One attitude was irritation and unease over American expansionism. Its westward movement, its claims to Oregon, its war with Mexico, its interest in Central America, its threats to Canada. Right? And that led to the suspicion in Britain that the Union's war effort was a war of conquest. It was an expression of the American desire to simply expand, take territory, and conquer. The other attitude was discomfort, even repugnance, over American behavior, the apparent product of its democratic society and government. Now, to put this in context, during most of the 19th century, the British and the Americans had a love-hate relationship. They were simultaneously attracted and repelled. They were tied together by economic interests, and financial arrangements. They were major trading partners, and most of the roads and canals and railroads in the United States that were being built were built with British investments, their money. They shared a common language and a common culture, and many British novelists were looked upon in the United States, especially Charles Dickens. Some this was not true of, but Charles Dickens was seen as a veritable American. The two legal systems had similarities, right? Common law, due process. But at the same time, the British found the Americans to be brash upstarts, coarse and money-mad, whose unlimited self-regard claimed exceptionalism in almost everything. While the Americans felt the British were better than thou, highbrows, haughty and patronizing, who with self-centered righteousness allowed the Americans proper recognition in almost nothing. Nevertheless, there was some transatlantic love, and we can see an example of that in the reception that the British heir to the throne received on his visit to the United States in 1860, the year just before the war starts. Huge crowds turned out in the United States and celebrated the visit of Queen Victoria's 18-year-old son, who would become King Edward VII. He's going to be married in 1863. You see what he more or less looked like. And apparently this, you could say, was an example of early interest in British royals. This goodwill in 1860 also reflected the end of Anglo-American friction over Central America, which in part had almost led Lord Palmerston, who will be Prime Minister during the Civil War, to threaten war with the United States. But by 1860, conflict between the United States and Britain no longer really seemed possible over issues in North America. But Palmerston and others were interested in checking American power. Hence, when in the fall of 1860, there was a growing sign of possible disunion and an apparent inability on the part of the Americans to come to some peaceful resolution, it was not entirely unwelcome news in Britain, and as we will see, it was not entirely unexpected. And in 1861, that pro-British acclaim for the future monarch Edward VII became anti-British resentment. And that leads to the third factor that shaped British opinion and contributed to the War of Ideas, and that's democracy. Gordon Wood, the preeminent American historian of the American Revolution, has said that the really interesting question about the Civil War is why the North fought at all. Why did the North not follow the advice of Horace Greeley, who was the editor of the New York Tribune, and said, "Let the erring sisters go in peace"? Lincoln's answer was that the Union had to be preserved to keep alive the ideals of the founders. In his message to the special session of Congress on July 4th, 1861, Lincoln said, "This is essentially a people's contest. On the side of the Union, it is a struggle for maintaining in the world that form and substance of government whose leading object is to elevate the condition of man, to afford all an unfettered start and a fair chance in life." But this argument for a democratic society and government did not have the same positive connotation in Britain. In Britain, it had a negative connotation for two reasons. One was the British political system, and one was the British assumption about democracy. Since the Glorious Revolution of 1688, Britain had had a constitutional monarchy. And that meant that the monarch, the king or queen, was no longer absolute, no longer above the law, but beneath the law. And the law was made by Parliament, officially king in Parliament, but increasingly it was just Parliament with the king or queen signing off. Hence, Britain had a representative form of government, but the right to vote in Britain was highly restricted, and the voting process was extremely irregular. As of 1830, only about 478,000 males out of about 24 million people had the right to vote in Britain. That's 1.9% of the population. And that means that, in effect, government in Britain was an oligarchy, ruled by the wealthy few. And that few was composed of the aristocracy and the gentry, those people at the top. They were the landed group. They had enormous wealth, status, power, and they believed that they were at the top of a God-ordained social hierarchy. God has set it up this way. It can't be changed. Everyone else had a virtual representation, and the many, supposedly, according to the ruling class, did not need a direct voice in the affairs of state because the upper classes, as the propertied people, would make the best decisions for all. And besides, the many, who were largely property-less and uneducated, if they made decisions, would probably pursue their own self-interest at the expense, I should say, of society at large. Well, the first major change in this system came since 1688, came in 1832 with the Reform Bill of 1832, which was introduced by a young Lord John Russell, who later will be the British Foreign Secretary during the Civil War. He's a young liberal Whig. And that bill of 1832 almost doubled the number of people who could vote in Britain, so that 5 Englishmen, 1 out of 5 Englishmen could vote, 1 out of 8 Scotsmen, 1 out of 20 Irishmen. So we're up to about 814,000 or so people. That's maybe 3.2% of the population. And by the end of World War I, Britain will have a full-fledged democracy as a result of a series of these reform bills. But in 1832 and in 1861 and even later, a majority of the British ruling class, Tories and Whigs, did not believe in democracy. In fact, the Lord John Russell will later become known as Finality Jack because he said that bill that he introduced was to be the final reform on Parliament and the right to vote. It was meant, in other words, to prevent democracy, not promote it. It was supposed to stop it in its tracks. So the British upper class, and especially the ultra-Tories, the conservatives most opposed to reform, issued warnings about the undesirable and destructive nature of democracy, and in 1861 they argued that the Civil War confirmed their contentions. It wouldn't have happened otherwise. They expected the war to discredit democracy fully and finally, so it wouldn't be proposed as a model for Britain anymore. The assumptions behind those arguments were widespread. The educated upper class in Britain were well versed in the classics such as Plato's Republic and Aristotle's Politics. And the British ruling class generally conceived of democracy according to the classical definition of the ancient world. That is, democracy was a defective form of government which naturally deteriorated into anarchy and then despotism. You don't want it. That was the message generated by Plato, Aristotle, etc. And also, since a republic, and therefore a democracy, was supposedly suitable only for a country of a small territorial size, and since American democracy, because of its aggressive popular will, seemed to demand more and more expansion, the British thought that disunion, which of course had been enlarged in the 1840s, they thought that disunion was only a matter of time. The conservatives in particular emphasized that history showed that democracies in large countries never succeeded, and they believed that the U.S. had simply outgrown its institutions. As a result of these attitudes, among the British ruling classes, the Civil War produced in Britain a very different interpretation from that of Lincoln. Many Britons, and especially conservatives, thought the American Civil War was the result of democracy, both because of its inadequacies as a form of government and because of its expansionist inclinations. The war, then, was not only one of conquest, but also one of irrational popular passions. Hence, many Britons in the middle and upper classes, during the first 2 years of the war, opposed the North and the conflict for three broad reasons. First, the war seemed wrong, misguided for practical reasons. Secession appeared to be irreversible and beneficial to both North and South. At least each would be free of the other. Second, secession seemed justifiable according to both precedent and the Constitution. The American colonies had set a precedent when they broke with the British Empire in 1776, according to the British view, and the Constitution provided for states' rights and government by consent of the governed. And third, the South seemed to be a separate nation which should be able to govern itself, and the North's cause, apparently one of conquest, was therefore condemnable. Viscount Palmerston, who becomes the Prime Minister of Britain during the Civil War, suggested that even if the North succeeded militarily, it could not restore a true union, one based on trust and confidence. Many Britons, therefore, thought secession was a right and a fait accompli, something that could not be taken back. And they disapproved of the war, therefore, as not only destructive and futile, but also despotic and imperialistic. The British thought the South would and should be allowed to secede, and above all, they opposed hostilities. Palmerston's government therefore adopted a wait-and-see policy. It was encouraged to take that position in part because intervention would probably mean war, which they really didn't want, and in part because of the widely accepted view that before a rebellious state could be recognized as independent, it had to be stable and prove that it was independent. So that meant that the Confederacy would have to prove itself on the battlefield. And as Howard Jones, an historian who has written extensively about this period, as he points out, the Confederacy then was faced with a conundrum. That was, according to Jones, how to achieve recognition that depended on victory in the battlefield, when victory on the battlefield probably depended on supplies, support, that was dependent on recognition. A vicious circle. Even so, the British did not stay totally uninvolved, and that was because of commercial and legal considerations as well as their attitudes. On April 19th of 1861, a week after the attack on the Union garrison at Fort Sumter, Lincoln, with the intention of simply closing all southern ports and probably gaining some time for the expansion of the Navy, Lincoln announced he was considering a blockade, But because under international law, a blockade is an act of war, the British government, the Palmerston Ministry, on May 14th, 1861, recognized the Confederacy as a belligerent and declared Britain neutral. That was the best way to keep Britain out of the war, but it suggested to the North that Britain was taking the South side. The North, in public opinion, immediately became anti-British. The Lincoln administration was distressed because the recognition of the Confederacy as a belligerent suggested that the Union was Britain was about to recognize the South as an independent state. But the British government did not recognize the Confederacy as an independent state. Lord John Russell, who now will be Earl Russell, argued that there were two reasons for the Declaration of Neutrality that should be accepted. And one of these was that according to the eminent legal theorist, the Swiss theorist Emmerich de Vattel, the Confederacy matched up with a definition of a true belligerent state fighting in a civil war, not just a rebellion. And secondly, Lord Russell argued that a declaration of neutrality would mean that everyone would be able to apply the rules of international conduct and hence avoid chaos. Of course, this also meant giving neither the Confederacy nor the Union everything each wanted, but it also allowed the Confederacy to prove itself if it could win on the battlefield. Well, partial proof came on July 21st, 1861, at the Battle of Bull Run. The Confederacy won that battle, and the Union Army afterwards seemed in complete disarray. The news of the inglorious rout of the Union forces and the stampede of the picnicking Northern socialites back to Washington was one more indication to the British that their presumptions were correct. Indeed, what they thought was that the South was fighting for independence, the North was fighting for vanity, and the North could not win. And indeed, it did have an effect. August Belmont, who was in Britain to try and get a loan for the North from British banks, was turned down after this defeat at Bull Run. And the most prominent of those banking houses, the Rothschilds, indicated that it would turn down such a loan because the war had, in their minds, no attainable purpose. They're not going to win, right? The North can't win. And under those circumstances, the Palmerston ministry seemed to have no real reason to intervene, except for humanitarian considerations. They could allow events to play themselves out. When the Confederate commissioners to Britain, led by William L. Yancey, went to Earl Russell in August and claimed that the Confederate victory at Bull Run showed that the Confederacy should be recognized as an independent state and thereby gain all the advantages that that would mean, Lord Russell rejected it outright. So Britain remained officially neutral. But the North had already uncovered proof that Britain was not strictly neutral. That summer, Confederate agents in Britain had begun to have considerable success, and perhaps the most successful of these was the naval agent, the Confederacy's naval agent, James D. Bullock. Bullock had arranged successfully for the construction of two vessels in Liverpool. One was to be a gunboat, and one was to be a top-of-the-line warship. Their warlike purpose, however, and their connection to the Confederacy were both denied. Strictly speaking, they were denied, strictly speaking, because this construction was contrary to the British Act of 1819, which, among other things, prohibited the construction of foreign warships in Britain. But the Laird shipyards, we're just going a mile a minute here now. The Laird shipyards, let me go back. The Laird shipyards, which were building these ships for the Confederacy, claimed that these ships were just merchant vessels. Charles Francis Adams, the U.S. minister to Britain, discovered they were being built, raised the issue with the British government and Lord Russell, but the British did nothing to seize these ships until later. And that's going to mean that the Confederacy will gain two major raiders, the most famous of which were the Florida and the Alabama. Well, the anti-British sentiment in the North, now we're going backwards, aren't we? can be seen in the treatment of William Howard Russell, who was the correspondent for the Times of London. Russell had described the stampede from Bull Run in terms that the North considered to be an insult. And as a result, we see increased anti-British sentiment in the summer and fall. And that sentiment became so strong that Russell felt that he no longer was able to speak freely. And ultimately, he and at least one other British journalist returned to Britain because they didn't feel they could report freely in the North. In the meantime, the reinforcement came for the British inclination to believe that secession was bound to succeed and that it would be good for the North, the South, and the end of slavery. That was provided by James Spence, a Liverpool businessman who had visited the United States and wrote a book published in September 1861 entitled The American Union. And in this, he argues that the North and the South were too different to ever be reconciled. They wouldn't ever be able to get back together. And the North was then again accused of denying reality and causing unnecessary suffering. With mutual animosity rising in the North and in Britain, in December of 1861, Britain came very close to intervening, perhaps the closest it's ever come in the war militarily. The stimulus was the Trent Affair. It threatened to bring war between Britain and the Union by providing an outlet for anti-British feeling in the North and by arousing the British sense of honor. Its beginnings can be traced to the failure of Yancey to get the British to recognize the Confederacy after the first battle of Bull Run, because Jefferson Davis decided to replace the Confederate commissioners with two new ones, James Mason and John Slidell. And they left Charleston on a blockade runner in mid-October, went to Cuba, and boarded the British mail packet, the HMS packet, the Trent, in Cuba. On November 8th, the irrepressible Navy Captain Charles D. Wilkes, the commander of the USS San Jacinto, stopped the Trent in international waters between Cuba and the island of St. Thomas. But instead of seizing the Trent and taking it to a prize court, he sent a boarding party on to the Trent, which only removed Mason, Slidell, and their secretaries. That was a mistake. It was a violation of international law and British rights on the high seas. It amounted to kidnapping, and kidnapping off a British vessel. The best Wilkes could have done would have been to take the Trent to a prize court and let the court decide whether or not those men and their papers could be removed. But he didn't do that. He allowed the Trent to continue with the papers on board. Casting even more doubt on this seizure by Wilkes was the fact that he took this action on his own without orders. However, when the San Jacinto arrived in Boston on November 25th, it was hailed in the North as a great victory. Wilkes was praised as a hero. People were ecstatic to take any action against the British. The South also expressed enormous enthusiasm at this development because they thought it would lead to war between the Union and Great Britain. Well, the story reached England on November 27th, and the reaction was almost violent. All Britain seemed outraged. The poet Matthew Arnold, who was a critic of the British aristocracy, British society, wrote, "Everyone I see is very warlike, I myself think it has become indispensable to give the Americans a moral lesson, and I fervently hope it will be given them. At the emergency meeting of the British Cabinet on November 29th, Palmerston, who was known for brinkmanship and, ironically, a great practitioner of gunboat diplomacy himself, seemed bent on war. He told Queen Victoria that the United States would have to make reparations for this insult to the British flag. And George Cornwall Lewis, who's pictured there, the British Secretary of War, who normally was pro-Union, member of the cabinet, wrote angrily, "We shall soon iron the smile out of their faces." So the British were ready for war. As a result, the British government alerted the Navy and began sending troops almost immediately to Canada. The official response of the ministry was an ultimatum. Mason and Slidell must be released, and an apology extended within 7 days of the receipt of the message. And if not, then Lord Lyons would be withdrawn, which was the first step toward war. And the Navy had orders to retrieve him. But before those dispatches were sent, they had to be cleared by the Queen. And when Lord Russell presented them to the Queen, and when her husband, Alfred, the Prince Consort, saw them, the Prince Consort was appalled. He thought they would certainly lead to war. And although on his deathbed, the Prince Consort then modified the language and included the statement, "Her Majesty's government are unwilling to believe that the United States government intended wantonly to put an insult upon this country, Britain." Nevertheless, Lord Russell informed Lord Lyons in Washington that the British government wanted a plain yes or a plain no as to whether or not Mason and Slidell would be released. In the meantime, the crisis seemed to become worse. While the Palmerston ministry remained officially neutral, the cabinet created, for only the 4th time in British history, a war committee. It focused on defending Canada and strengthening the Navy in North America and the West Indies. Pressure for war also came from outside Britain. France publicly condemned the seizure of Mason and Slidell and indicated that it would support Britain in the case of war, recognizing the Confederacy. The anger that existed in Britain was not immediately obvious in the United States because communication was so slow. Steamships had reduced the amount of time necessary to get across the Atlantic from around 3 weeks to about 10 days by 1865. But nevertheless, Charles Francis Adams did not receive information from Seward on this until December 16th. And that information stipulated that Wilkes had acted without authorization, but if the Palmerston ministry were to recognize the Confederacy, it would be war. And Adams was to present that information to Palmerston. Adams, however, aware of the war fever in Britain, provided Seward with a rationale for releasing Mason and Slidell. The Union should release them because of the principle of neutral rights, which the Americans, against British opposition, had struggled to establish earlier at the time of the War of 1812. Failure to comply, Adams said, with the British demand would only deny neutral rights and therefore American principles. Well, at first, the Lincoln administration seemed to think that all the British would do would be complain. When Seward discovered that there was a real likelihood of war, he began to argue for Mason and Slidell's release. Lord Lyons actually warned Seward in advance and then presented officially the diplomatic message, the demand, the ultimatum, on December 23rd. Lincoln held a cabinet meeting on Christmas morning. It was serious. The cabinet resisted the idea of releasing Mason and Slidell until at that meeting word arrived that France would support Britain in a war. The cabinet then wavered, and the next day agreed that Mason and Slidell should be released. Seward drew up a 26-page response in which, along with the justification that Mason and Slidell were virtual contraband, indicated that the captives were of comparative unimportance and would be cheerfully liberated. In effect, Seward, rather than apologizing, which is what the British wanted, congratulated Britain for adopting the principles of international law which the United States had long advocated. One could argue that brinkmanship, a fairly common Palmerstonian tactic, had worked. News of the release of Mason and Slidell arrived in London on January 8, 1862, and set off wild celebrations. But Seward's arguments were disputed. And not only were Mason and Slidell people, not contraband, but also the Duke of Argyll, famous Scotsman for his red hair, the Lord Privy Seal in the cabinet, contended that a neutral ship sailing between two neutral ports could not, by definition, carry contraband, and therefore the Trent was immune to search and seizure. But despite these and other British objections, the war fever in Britain had already subsided. The Prince Consort had died December 14th, and the national mood had turned somber. Hence, the Palmerston ministry accepted the release without further action. Of course, this acceptance indicated that the British wanted to remain neutral. If British honor was not at stake, as it seemed to be at first, then the government preferred to stay out, partly for practical reasons, partly because their beliefs about democracy meant that they still thought the Union would fail. And the Union could have failed as late as the fall of 1864, when Lincoln's re-election finally removed the possibility of a negotiated end to the war. The British had remained players as opponents of war generally, and therefore as supporters of peace, as possible mediators, and as unofficial suppliers of ships, ordnance, money. The British role reveals the uncertainty of events and the ambiguity of human motivation. The British disapproved of the war as senseless, futile, but they also wanted the end of slavery. The rightful triumph of freedom, freedom for the slaves, and of democracy, and of the Union, which are a major part of the American national mentality now, that triumph was not clearly destined to be. It was highly uncertain during the war. In the end, the war, or actually the desire to win the war, forced both the North and the South to do what neither intended initially: end slavery. As Jackson Lears, another American historian, has written, the pro-slavery revolution consumed itself. And it produced another revolution, one in human rights, but an enormous cost, as each side gained and lost the advantage. Despite the uncertainty of the war's outcome and continued British ambivalence, British assumptions began to shift by the end of 1862. The possibility of British mediation that fall was postponed after the inconclusive slaughter at the Battle of Antietam. And it was postponed because of the announcement of the Emancipation Proclamation. The Confederacy had not won the diplomatic war. Cotton had not forced the issue. It was losing the war of ideas because of the proclamation, Emancipation Proclamation, and it was not clearly winning on the battlefield, which, with Antietam, remained inconclusive. But in 1861, ideas about a separate people being rightfully self-governing, and slavery not being ended, and democracy being fatally flawed were all uppermost in British thinking. Most of all, to them, the war seemed irrational and horribly futile. The British wanted to stay out of it, but they also wanted it to end.